So this morning we're continuing our series looking at the book of Exodus. And if you missed the introduction last week, we did a whistle-stop tour through Exodus chapters 1 and 2. And you might want to listen back on YouTube. Top tip, if you are listening on YouTube, you can listen at half speed, which is always good, I think, if you're listening to me, because I do get quite fast, especially when I'm excited about passages. Today we're going to be having a look at Exodus 3 into Exodus 4:17. And this is the story of Moses and the burning bush. Perhaps a story you're really familiar with, or perhaps something that you're not familiar with. But there's some things that God wants to speak to us today. So we're going to start off by reading this text together. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. That is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you up out of the misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed towards this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. Moses answered, What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, The Lord did not appear to you? Then Moses said to him, What is in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, Throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, Reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Then the Lord said, Put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become white as snow. Now put it back in your cloak, he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored, like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these 2 signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground." Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I have slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and teach you what to say." But Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you and will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so that you can perform the signs with it." So it's quite a long passage, isn't it, to read all those sections together, but really it's one narrative across chapter 3 and 4. It's one of those places where you're not quite sure why the people doing the chapters and verses decided to split it there, because it is one story. And to me, this whole passage is about Moses wrestling with 2 questions. Who is God and who am I? This chapter starts off with a focus on Moses, who is tending flock in Horeb. Horeb is also known as Sinai. They think Horeb was the wider area and Sinai was the specific mountain. That's going to be relevant later on because God says you'll come back to this mountain, and they do later on in Exodus. And Moses is there tending flock, and it sounds like quite a peaceful life. But there's an awful lot of backstory here, isn't there, that was covered in chapters 1 and 2. And in many ways, Moses' childhood and early adulthood has been incredibly unsettling and traumatic. He was born at a time of great violence and oppression to his people. They are living in slavery, and Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, ordered the murder of all the Israelite baby boys. Moses is miraculously saved, but he's been forcibly separated from his family, from his entire people. He grows up with an Egyptian family, but he obviously knows he is a Hebrew. How does he feel about this? How does he identify? He clearly feels some discomfort at the way the Egyptians treat the Hebrews. There's a sense of injustice in him, but the way he tries to handle it himself, through violence, through killing an Egyptian, doesn't solve any problems. So then he experiences rejection from his Egyptian family because of what he's done. Pharaoh wants him dead. And he's rejected by his Hebrew people, who basically say, "Who do you think you are to have done that?" So now he's not with his own Hebrew people, he's not even with his adopted Egyptian family, he's in another place, with another group of people, yet again a foreigner. And he has his own family now, but he actually chooses to call his first son a name meaning foreigner, suggesting he definitely still feels like he doesn't fit in. So I don't think it's too much here, we're reading too much into the text to see that Moses probably had a bit of an identity crisis. Who is he, and where does he belong? And then in Exodus chapter 3, he meets God. But does he realise it's God? Does he understand who this God is? God calls to him twice, "Moses, Moses." And we see this double call a fair few times in the Bible. It happens with Abraham, with Samuel, Jacob, Martha, Simon, various people. And it usually means that God is about to say something important or call them to something important. But Moses' response seems fairly flippant if you read it in the Hebrew. It's a bit like, "Yep, here I am." Does he realise who he's talking to? Like, God, the creator of the universe. And it's like God then starts to point it out to him. He says, "Don't come any closer because you're on holy ground." And we've talked about this word holy before. God is holy because he is separate, he is different, he is pure. He is the only one like him. No one is like him. No one can compare. He is the source of all life. And I heard an analogy that talked about holiness being a bit like the sun. It's beautiful, it's life-giving, it's amazing, but if you get too close, you'll be consumed by it. And there's a sense of that in the way that God describes himself as holy and tells people to keep a distance, certainly in the Old Testament. Moses is told to take off his shoes as a sign of reverence. So Moses is obviously starting to understand who he's talking to. And then God starts to reveal more. He says, "I am the God of your father." Now, if you remember from last week, Moses' name effectively means son of, but the name would normally have another bit. So in Egyptian, you might be called Akmos or Tutmos, which means the son of Ak or the son of Mos. But here, Moses has just got the Moss bit. So he's basically saying son of, ... Who is he the son of? Who does he belong to? And yet here God says, I am the God of your father. He's saying, no, these is who you belong to. I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, your ancestors. He is saying to Moses, these are the people that you belong to. This is your identity. And this is the God speaking to him. I wonder how much Moses knew about Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. He grew up in the palace, but he was also nursed by his mom for a while. So how much does he know about his Hebrew and Israelite history? God uses this phrase repeatedly in the text, doesn't he? When you read it out loud, you realise how much he's saying the same thing. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. This is a core thing about who God is. He wants to be identified in this way. Because understanding that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob gives us more clues about who he is. We can look at what he did in the lives of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the promises that he made them, the way that he came through and showed himself, the way that he was faithful, the ways that he demonstrated his power, and we start to understand a bit more about who this God is. And it would seem that Moses knew enough from the stories to know to be afraid to look at God, to recognise him as a God of power, to recognise that he should be respected and revered, because it says Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then God continues to reveal more about himself, about his character, about what he will do. He is a God who sees, who hears, and is concerned. He calls the Israelites my people. Remember, he made a covenant, a promise with Abraham all that time ago that he would be his God and that God would be the God of his people, that he would bless his people and all his descendants, that he would provide for them, including providing a land of their own. And here we see that he has not forgotten that promise. And he says that he has a plan to act on it, to act on behalf of the Israelites and to save them from their suffering. I wonder what Moses is thinking at this point. Surely he's thinking, yes, this is great. His own family is in Egypt. Surely he longs to see them free. And he himself had been moved in the past by the plight of the Israelites in chapter 2. He clearly has that sense of injustice and he wants something to be done about it, although his way of handling it hadn't gone very well. So surely this is great news. Moses should be really excited and happy. God is going to sort it out. God is going to save them. And then God says to him, now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. If you were Moses, how would you feel in that moment? What would your response be? God says, I am sending you to confront the most powerful man you've ever heard of, a man who wants you dead, a man who is not afraid to kill innocent people. And I'm sending you to lead the Israelites, a group of people who you're not really sure you belong to, and a group of people who aren't sure you belong to them. They've already kind of rejected you in the past. Personally, I can empathise with the fact that Moses didn't seem particularly excited about him being the one who has to go and do what God is planning to do. His response is basically to say, me? Who am I that I should do this thing? I'm not the right person for this. And Moses will try and say this several different ways throughout this narrative. And I think it's really interesting how God responds each time. When Moses looks at himself and says, no way, I can't do this, God responds by pointing Moses away from himself and towards him instead. God doesn't say here, look, Moses, you're the perfect man for the job. You yourself have been rescued, so you know what that feels like. You were brought up in the palace, so you know the Egyptian culture and language. You've got a heart for justice, God doesn't respond by telling Moses all the reasons why he is the right person. He doesn't remind Moses of his qualifications or justify his reasons for choosing him. And he could have made some good and convincing points here, but ultimately that stuff doesn't really matter. Instead of saying to Moses, you're great, you can do this, you're amazing, God simply says, I will be with you. But Moses still isn't convinced. He doesn't believe in himself, and he doesn't think the Israelites will believe him either. So after initially asking God, well, who am I? He now asks God, well, hang on, who are you? Who do I say has sent me? What is your name? And perhaps this sounds like an odd question, but remember, Moses has grown up in Egyptian culture where there were multiple gods, and all the tribes and cultures around Egypt had their own gods too. So maybe he just wants to clarify, which God exactly is this that he's talking to? Who are you? What's your name? How do I explain you to other people? How do I define you? And God's response is basically to say, neither you nor any other person can define me. He gives his name, in the Hebrew it's Ayeh, Asher, Ayeh. And actually we talked about this a while ago when we looked at the I Am series of Jesus' I Am statements in John's Gospel. But just to recap, there's a few different ways this phrase can get translated, and it's one of those things that continues to be debated by scholars and discussed at great length. There's whole books written about just this short phrase, so I won't go into all of it now, but there's a few different ways you can translate it. I am who I am, or I will be what I will be. I am the one who is and will be. And basically, it's a way of God saying that his existence, his authority, his identity does not depend on anyone or anything else. He wasn't created by anyone else. He is eternal with no beginning and end, and no one or nothing else can alter who he is. But this phrase, Ayeh, I am, isn't just about saying God exists. If we think about the plight of the Israelites and the nerves that Moses is feeling here, he doesn't just need to know that God exists. They need to know that God is with them. And in the Hebrew, that phrase of to be is not like an existential to be or not to be kind of phrase. It's about being active and being present. So one scholar suggests that a better translation of this phrase would say to the people of Israel, I am present has sent you. And it is this I am phrase that Jesus uses in John's Gospel when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. But it would be a bit odd for Moses to say to the people, I am has sent me, because I and he, and who is he talking about? So instead, he says to Moses, when you're talking to other people, basically use the phrase Yahweh, which means he is, or he will be, or he is present. And that's the word in our Bibles that get translated as Lord, all in capital letters, so that we know it's this holy, personal name of God. And if we think about this name, this definition, in contrast to Pharaoh, the first half of Exodus is really about setting up the God versus Pharaoh battle that's going to play out in the first half of this book. And what do we learn about Pharaoh or the pharaohs in chapter 1 and 2? Well, at the start of chapter 1, there's a pharaoh that was there when Joseph was in Egypt, and then that pharaoh dies, and then there's a new pharaoh, and that pharaoh does some bad stuff, and then that pharaoh dies, and at the end of chapter 2, there's another pharaoh that comes to the throne. These pharaohs who set themselves up as divine, all-powerful beings, they die. The pharaohs come and go, but Yahweh will always be. And there's also something here of Yahweh saying, I will be who I will be, just you wait and see. Just you wait and see what I am going to do. He reveals his personal name to the people in Exodus through his words, but he shows the real meaning of his name through his actions. And in the next few verses, he outlines what actions he's going to take. He's a God who remembers his covenant. He sees their misery and oppression and is moved to act. He promises them a land flowing with milk and honey. And he's going to give Pharaoh the chance to let the people go. And only when Pharaoh refuses will he demonstrate his power in a way that will convince Pharaoh to let them go. And in fact, they won't just leave Egypt empty-handed, but the Egyptians are going to send them away with silver and gold. They'll leave with abundance. And so we come to chapter 4, and Moses has been told the name of Yahweh, the one speaking to him, the one calling him, and he's been told what Yahweh will do, but he's still not... Sorry, you might need to reset me there, Joe. I don't quite know what I did. But he's still not convinced as we arrive in chapter 4. Despite that all God Yahweh has said, he's still wrestling with the same two questions. Thanks. There we go. Who is God? He may know the name of God, but who is God really? Can God be trusted? Is he really who he says he is? Is he really powerful enough to take on Egypt? And I think he's still wrestling with this question, who am I? Because rather than be full of confidence at what God has called him to do, he continues to raise objections and questions about whether or not he can do it. Firstly, he's worried that the Israelites won't listen to him or believe him. Who am I that they should believe me? So God gives him a sign, a miracle he can show them to back up his claims. And I really love the way that God does this here. He asks Moses, what is in your hand? There's something here about saying to Moses, listen, you've already got what you need. It's already in your hand. And there's also something about the fact that God can take the ordinary thing, this staff that Moses would have used day in, day out as a shepherd, just this normal, ordinary, probably quite battered thing. God takes this ordinary thing and does something supernaturally amazing with it. It reminds me a bit of the story of the feeding of the 5,000, where God basically takes a packed lunch and turns it into something amazing. And sometimes for us, we can think, we don't have much to offer, I don't really have anything. But God can take the simple, small things that we have and through his power, use them in amazing ways. And God turns the staff into a snake. Well, why a snake? Well, the snake here represents Egypt or Pharaoh. You may have seen pictures of the headdress that Pharaoh wears. It's got a little snake on the top. And also, if you remember, the language that Pharaoh uses in chapter 1 about being sneaky and crafty is echoing back to Genesis chapter 3, where the snake is sneaky and crafty. The text sets Pharaoh up as a representative of evil, and we've certainly seen him do evil things. And the snake is an image of that evil. But Moses will be given authority over that snake. He'll be able to grab it as a demonstration that God has authority over Pharaoh. And he gives Moses a second sign, turning a healthy hand into a diseased one and back again, before offering Moses a third sign, turning water into blood. So Yahweh has given Moses 3 signs to show the Israelites, to remind them, to show them of his power and to show that he really is Yahweh's messenger. But Moses has further objections. He isn't a good speaker. He says, who am I? I've not got the right skills for this calling. And I was listening to a lecture on this, and the lady who's a professor in Hebrew was saying that even the way that Moses says, I'm not a good speaker, is not very good. It's kind of like, well, God, the thing is, I'm not very, like even the way he says it isn't very eloquent. He's saying, look, I just don't have the right gifts for this. I'm not the right person. But God's reply here is very similar to before. Don't look at what you can't do, Moses. Look at me. I am the one that created you. I'm the one that gives you speech. I will help you. And before, God has said, I will be with you. And actually in the Hebrew here, it says, I will be with your mouth. Like, let's get even more specific. I'll be with the exact bit that you're worried about. I'm going to sort you out. But Moses still isn't convinced. And it seems at this point that Moses has basically run out of legitimate excuses. So he asks more bluntly, God, please, please send somebody else. And I guess up to this point, Moses has offered objections that seem to be based on some legitimate fears or concerns, and so God has taken the time to reply. But here he is basically just refusing to do what God has asked, hence God's anger. Anger, and yet he does relent. Moses' final objection here seems to still be related to his worries about his speech. So God provides Aaron to speak for him and promises to help Aaron with his speech. And then the conversation seems to end quite abruptly, with God telling Moses to remember his staff, perhaps to remind Moses that he does still have a role to play here. Or I actually wonder if it's God just like finishing the conversation before Moses can come up with any more objections. Right, we're done now, remember your staff, off you go. That's my interpretation. It's not necessarily like that in the text. So we've looked there, that's quite a lot of text we've looked at, but what does this have to teach us? Well, I think we come back to those key questions again. What does this passage teach us about who is God? And what does this passage teach us about who am I? Maybe there are some of you here who are asking, well, who is God? Is there a God? Do I believe in a God? Maybe you're just starting to explore. When Moses saw the bush, he said, I'll go and have a look at this thing. I'll go and find out more. I'd encourage you, if you're just starting to explore who God is, go and have a look, go and find out more, ask the questions. You never know what will be revealed to you. And in this passage, we're told the name of God, Yahweh, the one who is and will always be, the one who is present, the one who remains the same, the creator, the all-powerful one. Perhaps you're facing a situation now where you need to be reminded of the power of God again, his holiness, his might, his sovereignty. He is bigger than any Pharaoh or any obstacle you could face, however mighty or powerful they seem. God describes himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob time and time again. He made a covenant, promises with these men and their families, and he demonstrated his power, his faithfulness, his strength, his compassion in their lives, and he will do the same again. Where can you look back and see God's previous faithfulness in your life or in the lives of others? What do you need to be reminded of today? Where has God already been? In the Old Testament, there's a bit of a habit of building altars or monuments, or Ebenezers they're called. This is where God did this, so they build an altar to remember that this is where God did this miracle. This is where God said this, so they build an altar to remember that God said that there. And those monuments serve as permanent reminders of what God has done and who he is. So what do you need to remember today? It's so easy to move on quickly and not go back and remember, God has already done this, God's already done this, God's already done this. Why would he start letting me down this now? I think it's in Joshua they build an Ebenezer and it says, thus far has the Lord brought us, just before they go on to the next thing. And there is a sense of God has always been faithful, so of course he's going to be with me in the next phase. We're also told about God in this passage that he's a God who sees and hears and is concerned for his people. I wonder if you've ever been in a situation where you have wondered, where is God? I mean, the people were in slavery for quite a while. Does God see you? Does he care? Does he see the situation that you're facing? I've definitely been in that place before, going through something difficult and feeling like God wasn't answering me. And many of us will have experienced times like that. It's actually a common experience of people in the Bible, particularly in the Psalms, where we seem to be saying, God, I'd like you to sort this out now, and God seems to be taking an awful lot longer, or seems to be quiet when we're asking for him to speak. If you're in a particular season of that at the moment, you might find it really helpful to use some of the words of the Psalms to help you in that prayer. Psalms of lament like Psalm 13 that say, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Or in Psalm 22, which Jesus himself quotes on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? These psalms wrestle with the honesty and pain of suffering and apparent silence or inaction from God, but they also hold on to the truth that we can put our trust in God and encourage us to make a choice to trust in him, even when it's hard. God is who he says he is. He is good and kind and mighty and powerful. He never leaves or forsakes us. He is mightier than Pharaoh or anything else that any of us could ever face, and he's going to demonstrate that might over the next few chapters. But what about this second question, who am I? Moses asks this question repeatedly in his objections to God's call on his life. And I think there's something here echoing back to chapter 2. In chapter 2, when Moses kills the Egyptian slave owner, and then he covers it up, and then the next day he sees some Israelites, and they say to him, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me like you killed the Egyptian? Effectively, they say to Moses, who do you think you are? I think those words have stayed with Moses, that they went down deep and have impacted the way he sees himself and continue to impact him. He seems to struggle to shake them off. How many times has he replayed those words and that situation in his head? I'm sure all of us can remember things that have been said to us, words that questioned us, words that got at the heart of our identity, that really bruised us and stuck with us. Maybe something a parent said to us, or a teacher in our childhood, maybe a friend or someone really close to us has said something to us that's really made us question who we are. And if we're careful, those words can shape our identity and limit us as well. We have to be really careful in the way that we discern what we accept as truth. Is it what those people say, or is it what God says? It's so easy to let lies rule us instead of truth, or sometimes the lies have been so strong in our minds for so long that we've come to believe them as truth. In Romans chapter 12 it says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing and perfect will. Sometimes we have to fight for the truth when we've accepted a whole load of lies that have limited our identity. I've certainly had that experience in my life when someone who was in a position of power over me spoke a lot of negative things about me. And if I'd continued to believe those lies, I definitely wouldn't be stood here. They were telling me I shouldn't want to lead, I shouldn't want to preach, I shouldn't be this, I'm too that, I'm not good enough, and all that kind of stuff. And it took a long time for me to recognise that those things weren't true and to hear the truth. And friends and family were really important in that. They spoke the truth over me. And I also had verses that I clung on to. I learned Ephesians chapter 1. I think I've said this before, but I learned Ephesians chapter 1. And I've still got, actually, I meant to bring it today. The mirror in my bedroom, my long mirror, has got words written from Ephesians chapter 1 in it. So when I look in the mirror, I'm reminded that I am chosen, that I'm loved, that I'm redeemed, that I'm forgiven, that I'm called. That is the truth of how God sees me. We have to come back to the truth all the time, because ultimately our identity is found in God, and it's what he says that really matters. And it may be that going through that rewiring process in our brains might be a long process. It's not always an instant thing, and we might need some help in that, maybe counselling or prayer ministry or different things. And it might also be that as we move forward in what we feel God has called us to do, that we do need some training. We want to steward the gifts and responsibilities that God has given us. Nattie's saying she wants to be a nurse. She can't just turn up in hospital and say, I'm a nurse, God's called me to this. She's like, hang on a minute, get some training, get some experience. Training is a good thing. And all those things can be useful. We want to steward what God has given us. But ultimately, our confidence can't come from our qualifications or our training, because however much you train, whatever you do, there's always going to be some things that you don't know. And ultimately, our confidence needs to come from the way that God sees us and what he says about our identity. We see this time and time again in this narrative. As Moses wrestles with his identity and calling, the most important thing he needs to know when asking the question, "Who am I?" was to know that the great I am was with him. Because walking with God, being led and empowered by him, is so much more important than any qualifications or skills that or confidence we can have in ourselves. If God calls us, he will equip us. We are most ready for the task ahead when we are most reliant on him and not ourselves. And Moses can't seem to grasp that here in Exodus chapter 3 and 4, but it seems to be a lesson that he learns over time. Later on in Exodus 33, we'll get to that in November, God and Moses are having a discussion about the next step in the journey for God's people. And Moses said to God, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us from here." By this point, Moses has learned that the most important thing that he needs and that the people need is the presence of God with them every step of the way. Perhaps you are asking some questions. Can I do this? Am I qualified enough? Do I have the wisdom for this? Do I have what I need? Come back to the great I am, who has everything you could ever need. Personally, to me, Moses wouldn't seem like the ideal candidate for leadership here. He's got identity issues, unresolved trauma, he's not good at public speaking, he killed somebody. Is this who you would pick to be a leader in God's kingdom? But so often, God picks the unlikely people to do amazing things. And it says in the New Testament, doesn't it, his power is displayed through our weakness. That's how he's almost glorified more. So don't rule yourself out. Whatever you think you don't have or whatever would disqualify you from what God's calling you to, do not rule yourself out. And maybe you're in a season of asking, who am I? Or maybe you can see that your identity has been defined by circumstances and people and not by God. You might want to consider doing the identity and destiny seminars with Elijah House. The leaflets are over here, and that'll help you think through that a bit more. But I want to encourage you, you might have to fight for it a bit. Our enemy is a really great liar. It's the best thing he does, basically. And his words will steal and kill and destroy. They will rob you of the destiny that God has for you. But instead, Jesus said that he has come that we might have life and life in all its fullness. He has the words of eternal life. He is the way, the truth, and the life. So find your identity in him. When you're asking, who am I? Remember that he says you are loved, you are chosen, you are valued, you are forgiven, you are called, you are redeemed, you're blessed, and you're equipped for whatever it is he is calling you to. I'm going to invite the worship team up now because we're going to close with a song that really talks about that, about knowing our identity is in God, about knowing that we are who God says we are. So let me just pray before we sing together. Lord, I thank you for the truth in this narrative. Lord, I thank you for the truth of who you are, that you are the same yesterday, today, and forever. You are the great I am. Nothing can change you. No one can change you. No one can compare to you. No one comes before you or will come after, and nothing we could face could ever be bigger or more powerful than you. I thank you that you are big and powerful and mighty, and yet you are concerned about us. You see the things that we face. You care about the struggles that we have. You listen to our cries. Lord, for those of us who are asking questions about who you are, show yourself afresh in a real and tangible way this week. And Lord, I thank you for the truth about who we are in you. I thank you that there are no lost causes. I thank you that no one is disqualified from you, that you offer your love and forgiveness and healing and restoration to everybody. If you can use someone like Moses, you can use any of us. Lord, would you help us when we have listened to other voices, when other things have shaped how we see ourselves and how we limit ourselves? Would you break those things away? Would you give us freedom through the power of Jesus? Would you help us to live in the fullness of who you've made us to be and to fulfill the callings on our lives? In the moments where we look at ourselves and see our limitations, help us look to you and see the truth of who you are. Renew our minds, Lord. Let your truth sink deep down. and beat and defeat any lies that may be there. We want to live our lives based on the truth of who you are, God. So would you come in your power and do that for us now, Lord? Amen.